Hello, everybody. I'm Happy Caldwell, and I thank you for joining me today for today's edition of Arkansas Alive. All this week, we're teaching on ownership, the law of empowerment. So stay tuned, get your Bible. I want you to get this revelation. Stay tuned. Arkansas Alive starts right now. We were getting ready to read out of Luke 15 and beginning with verse 11. In fact, we read that one verse as we get started. And I say this because in an effort to explain and to show you the difference between owners and stewards, I found this scripture, this story about the prodigal son, and I use sons and servants as an example to show you the difference between owners and stewards. And I think you'll get the a connection here. Okay. A man had two sons. The younger of them said to his father, "Father, give me the portion of goods that falls to me." And he divided unto them his living. So the son, notice, the son, underline it, the son asked the father for his inheritance. It belonged to him, according to Jewish custom, according to the laws of inheritance. And he divided to him the portion that belonged to him, and he divided unto them, his sons, his living. And not many days after, the younger son gathered all together and took his journey into a far country, and there wasted his substance. Now notice, underline the word his. This son took ownership of what his father had given him. His father had given him his inheritance. It belonged to him, and he took it, and he took ownership of it. It says he took his living, his substance. And when he'd spent all, there arose a mighty famine in that land, and he began to be in want. And he went and joined himself to a citizen of that country, and he sent him unto his fields to feed swine. Now this is this is a challenge for a Jewish young man. He would have filled his belly with the husks that the swine did eat, and no man gave unto him. And when he came to himself, he said, "How many hired servants of my father's have bread enough and to spare, and I am perishing with hunger." Now get this, this young man, he's an heir. His father has given him his inheritance. He's taken ownership of it. And all of a sudden he's thinking, here I am eating the husk from the corn, fed to the pigs, which Jews didn't have anything to do with pigs, pork. And he said, and yet in my father's house are many servants, and not a one of them are starving. They're not hungry. They've got plenty to eat. Notice we're talking about sons and servants. And so he said, "I will arise and go to my father, and I will say unto him, Father, I've sinned against you, against heaven, and before you, and I'm no more worthy to be called your son. Take me as one of your hired servants." Now that young man was asking his father to do something that he could not do. He could not disown him as a son. He was a son. He was born a son. You're a son and a daughter of God. How did you get to be that way? You got born again. You got born into the family. Well, when you got born into the family, you became an heir and a joint heir with Jesus to all of God's covenant promises. So he told his father, he said, "Father, I'm no more worthy to be called your son. I've been living a riotous life, and I've squandered all my money and that you gave me. My inheritance is gone, and I'm hungry. Make me one of your hired servants." The reason I'm laughing is because I remember when my daddy had a talk with me about what I was going to do with my life. I was 18, graduated high school, and I had to make a decision. He said, "Son, you need to make a decision." He said, I've got the money to send you to college. If you don't go now, I don't know if I'll have it when your sister's ready to go to college, but I've got the money now. You can go to college. You can go in the military and fulfill your military obligation. I mean, that's the way we looked at it at our house. There was an obligation to serve your country. Daddy served in World War II, and he expected me to serve in some branch of the service. He said, or number 3, you can go to work. You can go get a job, and you can get in the workforce. He said, now the choice is yours. But he said, there's one thing you need to know. You are not going to stay and live in my house. My jaw dropped down. I'd never heard that before. My house. I thought it was my house. He said, no, it's my house, his house. He built it. He owned it. I just lived there. I had a room there. And I could go and eat there 3 meals a day. My mother washed my clothes. She cleaned the house. She cooked the meals. But when I got ready to leave, Daddy said, now he said this to me. He said, now if you choose to live in this house, my house, all the food that's in the refrigerator is my food, not yours. It's yours because you're my son. But if you decide to stay in this house, you're going to pay me $40 a month room and board. Now this was in the late 50s, early 60s. I thought, pay to live in my own house? It's not your house. Pay to eat my own food? No, it's not your food. I mean, this was an awakening unto me. And he said this to me. I mean, and he's saying all this in love and kindness, and he's not being ugly about it, but he's just letting me know the reckoning has come for you to go on your own. He said, I've done my part, I've raised you, and now it's up to you. But he said, if you decide to live in this house and you get a job and you work in the community, he said, don't be bringing your dirty clothes. No, he said, you can get an apartment. You can live somewhere else if you want to. You can get an apartment, live on your own, rent a house or an apartment, whatever. But don't be bringing your dirty clothes over here for your mother to wash. Wow, man. And it, it almost was depressing. I'm being kicked out. No, I wasn't being kicked out. I was being encouraged to go out into my own life. And, I'll tell you what I did. I made the decision. I went to college that first year. And then I got tired of college. I didn't care much for it. It was just, it wasn't everything I thought it was cracked up to be. And so I enlisted in the Navy. I joined the military, went into the Navy, and served 2 years at sea, 2 different ships. And then I came home, and then I went to work. So I actually did all 3 of the things that he showed me to do. I just did them in a different order. But the point I'm trying to get you to see here is the servant is not a son, and the son is not a servant. Have you ever lived in a rent house? Have you ever lived in a house or an apartment that you didn't own? You just rented it? I have. Both as a young man and then when I got married, I lived in an apartment. So I didn't have the money to buy a house. I didn't until I got saved, and I used my GI loan that I'd never used, and I used it to buy my first house. And Jeannie and I lived in this house that we had built using my GI loan, nothing down, and it just, it was a beginning. But up until that time, we'd lived in rental properties, apartments, and so forth. And I noticed there's something about living in a rental property that you don't own. You're not responsible for anything. I could call the landlord and tell him, the roof's leaking, or we need this fixed, the plumbing, or whatever. I didn't own the house. I didn't own the apartment, so it wasn't mine to care for and take care of. All I did was pay the rent. And, I'm a very conscious conscientious person. My family raised me that way, my father, my mother. And so I would never treat anybody else's property any different than I treated my own property. I've seen people in hotels, if you stay in hotels much, which we did for years, and you walk down the hall of the hotel and you can look into those rooms. I was shocked the first time I walked down a hallway and saw a hotel room. There was clothes all over the floor. There was towels all over the floor. I mean, it looked like a tornado had hit that room. And what it amounted to, the people that had rented the room and were staying in this hall, I wondered if they lived that way at home. I wonder if they throw all their clothes on the floor at home or throw all the towels on the floor at home. I kind of doubt it. I'm sure some people do. But what it amounts to is when you live in a rental, you live in a hotel, it's not yours, doesn't belong to you, so you don't take care of it. It's not yours, not your problem. You don't own it. So it's a rental. Somebody else owns it, and you're just a renter. And that's the way a lot of people feel about the things of God. They have not taken ownership of the gospel. They've not taken ownership of the message of salvation. They've not taken ownership of healing, praying for people to be healed. They've not taken ownership of the finances that God gives them. You have to take ownership of it. And the contrasting viewpoint of we are not owners, we're just stewards. The selling point is, since we're not owners and we're just stewards, we have to be good stewards of God's money. And that's the big selling point of the, reverse of what I'm teaching you. Have to be good stewards of God's money. Well, let me ask you the question. Are you a good steward of the rent house that you're living in? Are you a good steward of the car you rented? Have you ever, when we used to have to fly and get a rental car, it's amazing how trashed those cars are. And of course they started charging you. And people just trash the car. Why? They don't own it. It's not theirs. They don't take any ownership mindset of that automobile. It's not theirs. They're just renting it. Well, when you don't take ownership of what God's given you, it never becomes yours. And you give out of what God has given you. Now, the tithe belongs to God. That's His. But the rest of it belongs to you. Now, I've heard the teaching, and you have too, that it all belongs to God. Well, in a general sense, everything that's in the earth, God created. And we've already established that. The earth and the fullness thereof belongs to God. But then in Psalm 115:16 it says, and the earth hath He given to the sons of men. So if you give the tithe, which is God's, you don't own that. That's His. That belongs to Him. But the other 90% is yours to give out of when God asks you to. Now I know, and you can think this way if you want to, well, it doesn't any of it belong to me, it all belongs to God. Well, you're going to find out differently in this series when we get to the stewards, when we get to those who are supposed to be giving and investing out of what the Lord has given them. Let's move on, because I want to get this prodigal son imprinted in your mind. Okay. So he said, I'm no more worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his servants, this is verse 22, Luke 15:22, bring forth the best robe, put it on him, on his son, and put a ring on his hand, shoes on his feet, and bring here the fatted calf, kill it, let's eat and be merry. For this my son. He never did call him his servant because he was a son. He couldn't be a servant. He was born a son. This my son, listen to this, was dead and is alive again. He was lost and he's found. And they began to be merry. They began to celebrate. Now the elder son was in the field, and he came and drew nigh to the house because he heard the music and the dancing. And he called one of the servants and asked, What does all this mean? And the servant said unto him, Your brother has come home, and the father hath killed the fatted calf, because he hath received him safe and sound. And the older brother was angry and would not go in. Therefore came his father out and entreated him, and he answering said to his father, Father, all these years I did serve you, neither transgressed I at any time your commandment, and you never gave me a kid. You never had a party for me and my friends. But as soon as this thy son was come home, which had devoured thy living, he tried to throw it off. He was trying to throw his brother under the bus. He has devoured thy living. Well, we plainly found out in the previous verses, this son took his inheritance and made it his. He took ownership of what his father had given him. So to properly read this, it should have said, thy son, which was come, hath devoured all his living. Not the father's living, his brother's living, with harlots. Now, of course, I always wondered, and others have too, how he knew he was running with harlots. You've killed for him the fatted calf. And he said unto him, now listen to this, Son, you are always with me, and all that I have is yours. Wow. Perfect example of the son and the servant. The son was born into the family. You're born into the family of God. Everything that he had, everything the Father has, is yours, belongs to you. He made sure that you became a joint heir with Christ, and you became a son or a daughter, and that all belongs to you. Everything God created belongs to you. Now here we're talking about ownership, the law of empowerment. So, when Satan comes to steal from you, is it about letting him steal and then running after him to get 7 times back? No. What did God say? He said it's about ownership. When Satan comes to steal from you, whether it's money, time, your health, your wealth, whatever it is, when Satan comes to steal from you, what do? What does the ownership privilege do to empower you? Ownership, the law of empowerment. I can stand up and point my finger in the devil's face or demon spirits or whatever, and I can say, no, you don't. That is not your money. That is not your house. That is not your health. That is not your wealth. You get your hands off of that. It belongs to me by divine decree. No, Satan, you cannot have that. That is not yours to steal. It's mine. It was given to me by God. Now, you understand I'm not getting off into pride and all that kind of stuff. There is a danger. There is a ditch on both sides of every road. Well, I'm talking about ownership. No, Satan, you cannot steal this from me. Isn't that better than letting him steal from you and say, oh, well, I don't know why God's allowing this, and what did I do to open the door to this, and him hawing around and wishy-washy and get over into the extreme God's sovereignty. I don't know why God allowed this, and then run after the devil and make him pay back 7 times. No, he said it's not about that. It's about ownership. It's about who owns the earth. It's about who owns the promises. It's about who owns the covenant of the word that God gave you. So you have the authority and the right to tell Satan when he comes to steal from you, no, you get your hands off that. That is not yours. It doesn't belong to you. That is God's promise to me. That is God's provision for me. Now, if you let him steal it, you can go back and claim Proverbs chapter 6 You can demand him to give it back to you 7 times. But if that's the only revelation you get, and you spend all your time running after the devil, trying to get him to give back what he stole, can you imagine what Satan has stolen from believers for generation after generation after generation? When all they had to have revelation of was, that was given to you by God, and he intends for you to take ownership of it. I'm not talking about covetousness. I'm not talking about greed. I'm talking about walking in your inheritance. Now, it's very interesting to me when I finished that Luke 15 and I saw the difference between sons and servants. You start with Luke 16, right after the teaching on the prodigal son. Chapter 16, Luke 16, verse 1, and he said also unto his disciples. Here comes, as Paul Harvey used to say, the rest of the story. And he said also unto his disciples, there was a certain rich man which had a steward. Oh, so he goes from teaching about sons and servants to teaching about stewards and owners. Let me go over to, I wrote this down. Let me see if I can go back. Let's go to Luke 19, and let's look at verse 12. Luke 19 and verse 12. And he said, a certain nobleman went into a far country to receive for himself a kingdom and to return. And he called his 10 servants. Now listen to this, 10 servants. And delivered to them 10 pounds, and said unto them, occupy till I come. But his citizens hated him and sent a message after him, saying, we will not have this man reign over us. And came to pass that when he returned, having received the kingdom, then he commanded these servants to be called unto him, to whom he'd given the money, that he might know how much every man gained by trading. Now, here's another thing I want to seed into you. Stewardship is what you do with what you have been given. These servants were going to be held accountable for what they had been given. What the nobleman gave them, he was going to require an accounting. Same goes for us. We get the judgment seat of Christ, we're going to be held accountable for what God has given us, whether we were good stewards of what he gave us. And if you don't take ownership of it, if you don't have that ownership mentality, which is the law of empowerment, you'll just flounder around and make excuses and all kinds of things. But if you take ownership of it, knowing you're going to have to give account at the judgment seat of Christ, it should stir you up. I asked my dad one time, now my job at home, we lived out in the country in those days in the 50s, and I say it was the country. It's now it's now a subdivision, but back then it was the country, and they didn't have power mowers. They had just began to produce a lawnmower that had a motor on top of it, and it was my job to cut. It was a quarter of an acre. It was my job to cut the grass, chop the wood, trim the hedges, just do whatever needed to be done, spring, summer, fall, winter. And I just was griping and complaining about it, and I let that lawnmower get away from me, and this was a big deal. Today it would be called a brush cutter. And I let it get away from me, and it went over and chewed up 2 hedges that my father had planted. Oh man, he came out and he chewed me up one side and down the other and said, just go on, I'll do it myself. Well, that made me feel so bad. So I got on my bicycle and I rode off and I rode around. I came back, and so I sat down with my daddy and I said, Daddy, what is it about me that's different than you? I said, why don't I have the desire or whatever it takes to take the initiative to do these things? Actually, I didn't know the word, but why don't I take ownership of what you've given me to do? And my daddy said, he said, when I wasn't much older than you, I think I was probably 16, maybe 15, 16. He said, when I was 18, just 2 years older than you, he said, World War II started, and I was shipped out, and he said, I had a wife and 2 children. And he said, that'll make anybody worth their salt, because he was in the Merchant Marines, that'll make anybody worth their salt stand up and act responsible. He said, now, I'm not advocating that you get married, and he was trying to make sure that I understood. I needed to learn to handle the responsibility of cutting the grass and cutting the wood. I didn't need to be going off and getting married. And he shocked me with that. He just imprinted me with that, and I thought, okay, I got it now. My daddy had responsibility. He had to take ownership of the fact that he had a wife and 2 children. He had a family to take care of. I don't have that. But I do have a wood pile, and I do have a backyard full of grass, and I do have other responsibilities. And so if you don't take ownership of what God has given you, you won't be a good steward. And here he's talking about servants that he has given. He said in verse 13, he delivered them 10 pounds and said unto this first one, he said, occupy till I come. Take ownership of this till I come. And then when he was returned, verse 15, he came to pass that when he was returned, having received the kingdom, he commanded these servants to be called unto him, to whom he had given the money or silver, it says, that he might know how much every man had gained by training. Then came the first, saying, I have gained 10 pounds. He said, well, good servant, because you've been faithful in very little, have authority over 10 cities. And we're going to pick this up here tomorrow because we're running out of time. And he went through each servant and what they had done with what they had been given. So ownership is the law of empowerment. It empowers you to be a good steward over what you have been given. Join me tomorrow and we'll continue with ownership, the law of empowerment. And remember, Jesus is Lord of Arkansas and wherever you're watching in the world, too.
Send your questions, comments, and testimonies to Happy Caldwell at Post Office Box 26207, Little Rock, Arkansas 72221, or email happycaldwell@vtntv.com. Remember to follow VTN on Facebook at VTN Your Arkansas Christian Connection, and follow Happy Caldwell on Twitter at Happy_Caldwell. VTN is on Roku. Search VTN in the channel store and add us to your lineup. Today's episode is available to watch on demand at VTNTV.com and click Watch. You can also watch VTN via live stream at VTNTV.com.